Okay. All right. Well, let's get started. I guess it's our first call since the inauguration, and certainly our first call since the governor's budget address, so we have a lot to cover. We'll start in Washington. We've got Doug Rice from the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. I forgot to look up your title, Doug, so if you want to give us a little background, you're welcome to. But the Center has been a terrific partner in providing us with great information to advocate for affordable housing and help us understand what's going on in Washington. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Doug.
Well, hello, everyone, and thanks very much for having me on today. Just a word about the Center. So I'm part of the housing policy team here at the Center, but I'm sure most of you know this, but just in case, the Center does a broad range of work on policy areas that affect low-income families, health care, food and nutrition, tax policy, and broader budget issues. And I mention that partly because I'm going to touch on a number of issues today that are really about broader budget and tax issues. And just to note, there's much more detailed information on our website about everything I'll talk about today. So to start on an outlook for the year, I mean, I think that it's clear that the legislative landscape is really unusually challenging this year. As you all know, Republicans swept the elections. They've come in with a very ambitious agenda, and yet at the same time, there are some pretty significant divisions within Congress, and not just divisions between Republicans and Democrats, but divisions within each of those caucuses as well. And, of course, the Trump administration is also just getting going and will presumably have a lot of influence this year. And yet the direction of that influence is pretty uncertain in many areas. It's not clear what their priorities will be in many areas and what they'll be proposing. That's a long way of saying that I'll have a lot to say today, of course, but the situation is really dynamic and fluid. It's really been changing on a daily or weekly basis down here, and it's very possible that half of what I say today could change in 2 weeks. So keep that in mind as you're listening. So broadly, the way we see things this year, I think the overarching theme for us is that what we're looking at is really the gravest threat to the social safety net that we've seen in many decades here in Washington. And I'll talk about some of those threats. At the same time, and this is always the case, it's possible that there will be a couple of opportunities to do some positive things too, and I'll flag those as I go along. So just some broad background. So one thing that is clear is that Republicans are setting the agenda in Washington, and certainly in Congress. The two biggest priorities this year are to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act and also to enact some broad-based tax reform. Congress has already started on the ACA repeal. They approved a fiscal year 2017 budget resolution back in January. That resolution included what we call reconciliation instructions on the Affordable Care Act. The importance of reconciliation instructions is that when there's a budget resolution with reconciliation instructions, which basically direct appropriate committees in Congress to produce legislation fulfilling those instructions at some later date, the resulting reconciliation bill receives a privileged process on the floor, especially in the Senate, and specifically to pass a reconciliation bill in the Senate, one needs only 51 votes rather than 60, which is often the case for anything that's controversial. Of course, we don't know yet what that reconciliation bill is going to look at. It could very well, likely it seems, to repeal the expansion of Medicaid, certainly repealing the Affordable Care Act, some of the subsidies and other provisions, risk the loss of insurance for millions of people. And yet, as I said, we haven't seen a bill yet, and it's looking like Republicans are finding it much more challenging than perhaps they anticipated in formulating a replacement bill. So, in fact, they had hoped to have all of this done already, but because of the challenges, it's really been pushed back. And at the moment, the timing of when we'll see a reconciliation bill repealing and replacing the Affordable Care Act is hard to predict. There are some folks on the Hill are saying, well, we'll have this out in the next 30 days or so. Others are much less optimistic, and so we may see one in March. It could slip a good deal. So that's the ACA repeal. The other big issue is tax reform, of course. After Congress deals with the ACA, then they will next move to a fiscal year 2018 budget resolution, which is really a budget blueprint for the next year. That resolution will include, it will set discretionary program funding levels, defense and non-defense. As you all know, most housing and community development programs are on the non-defense side and are discretionary. But it will also include, again, reconciliation instructions to make tax changes and possibly some entitlement program changes as well. But again, the strategy seems to be, I mean, there are still some on the Hill who hold out hope of pushing through a bipartisan tax reform bill. But most likely what we'll see is a reconciliation bill that, again, can be approved in the Senate with just 51 votes. And from the perspective of low-income families and the safety net, this presents some real difficulties. So first of all, if a big tax reform bill actually reduces revenue significantly over time, then this in effect forces deep cuts in spending in other areas to address the nation's long-term budget challenges. And most folks on the Hill and President Trump as well have vowed to protect Social Security and Medicare. And if they do that, then over the long term, these reductions will come largely from safety net programs like Medicaid and SNAP, and then a host of programs that provide benefits for middle-income families too, education programs, law enforcement, that sort of thing. Another big issue is that under the reconciliation rules, if Congress wants to make permanent changes in the tax code, that is, tax changes that extend beyond the 10-year budget window, the bill cannot add to the deficit outside of the 10-year window. And so there are some in Congress who are very anxious to make permanent changes, and so if those changes would reduce revenues, as they almost certainly will, this will require them to find large offsets, budgetary offsets, beyond the 10-year window to pay for those changes. One thing we're very concerned about under that scenario is that Congress would pair tax cuts with very deep cuts in Medicaid, especially, and possibly SNAP, the food stamp program. In recent House budgets over several years, we have seen proposals to make deep cuts in Medicaid through block grant proposals, or now there's talk of a per capita cap, which, while the structure of that is very different than a block grant, the effects are very similar in terms of reducing the availability of of coverage and benefits. So that's certainly something to keep an eye on too, from the perspective again of low-income families. The timing of all this is a bit uncertain. At the beginning of the year, the sense was that Congress would try to begin work on a 2018 budget resolution sometime in March, and then begin work on tax legislation and so on in April. Because the Affordable Care Act debate in that work has slipped already and is likely to continue slipping for a while, this has the effect of pushing the 2018 resolution and potential tax legislation further back as well. So at the earliest, we'll see that in sometime in April or March or April, but it's likely to slip beyond that, it seems to me. Just again, about all of these issues, ACA, repeal, tax policy, there's a huge amount of information on our website if you're interested in looking up details on those. So these are the two big priorities. Both of them are complex and very challenging, and so they'll consume a fair amount of time, of Congress's time, over the next at least through July and possibly longer than that. In addition to these two priorities, there's a number of sort of major pieces of legislation that are on the sort of must-pass list, and these tend to be reauthorizations of major programs. So there's always a defense authorization bill that has to go through. There's some legislation on FDA user fees, has to be reauthorized. The S-CHIP program, the Children's Health Insurance Program that's run by states, that has to be reauthorized this year, and there are a couple of others. So when you put the two big priorities on the table and then all these others, the end result is that most of the time this year is really going to be taken up by those things, it seems to me. So this kind of raises a question, what about everything else, and specifically budget and appropriations? I think what we're going to see this year, while budget and appropriations is really critical, especially for families that rely on federal housing assistance programs, they are going to be lower on the priority list this year than typically they are. So the other big thing when it comes to budget and appropriations is that whereas the big health care and tax legislative vehicles will likely be moved under reconciliation, as I said, which allows them to move it through the Senate on majority vote. In budget in the appropriations sphere, the Democrats are likely to have a much more important role in the passage of any legislation, and that's partly because to move appropriations bills in the Senate, they will need 60 votes to do that, including at least 8 Democrats. But in the House, too, there are also divisions within the Republican caucus that make it very possible that the only way to move appropriations through the House will be with some Democrat votes as well. So it's important to keep in mind that the Democrats are likely to have more of a role in appropriations than in the health and tax areas. First of all, we haven't finalized 2017 appropriations yet. Programs are, as I'm sure you all are aware, are currently operating under a continuing resolution, basically being funded at 2016 levels. That resolution is set to expire on April 28th. It's a bit unclear how Congress will wrap up 2017 appropriations or when they'll do it. Our sense is that certainly with respect to the transportation HUD title of any bill, that the subcommittee staff have largely negotiated, if they haven't completed it already, they will within the next several weeks, largely negotiated details, but that's sort of making assumptions about what the overall funding levels will be for non-defense discretionary programs this year. So the timing is uncertain. I had kind of hoped for a while that as the ACA stuff got pushed back, that maybe that would open up some floor time to move some packages of appropriations bills, but I'm not sensing any great urgency on the Hill to do that. So at the moment, I'm guessing that all of this pretty much, at least the finalization of the bill gets pushed into late April, even though, as I said, committees will be working on drafting final legislation over the next several weeks, if they haven't completed it in some cases already. The form of the final bill is also uncertain. It could be a package of bills. It could be another continuing resolution with what we call anomalies. So those are specific provisions that increase or reduce funding for particular programs or program areas. I don't think it's really too significant what the form of the bill is. What matters is program funding levels, and that's what I would encourage folks to focus on. I will mention one big issue in the final HUD bill, and that's Housing Choice Voucher renewal funding. We issued a paper on this last December and recently posted an update. Because of rising rents around the country and stagnating incomes, and here I'll mention specifically, as you all know, about half of the households using housing vouchers are seniors or people with disabilities. These are folks living on Social Security or SSI. The federal government announced the cost of living adjustments for 2017, and they're very low. They're less than 1% this year. And so what that means is that when rents are rising at a clip of say, 3%, which roughly they are nationally, and household incomes, at least for those fixed income households, are rising at less than 1%, that means the voucher subsidy has to grow by well over 3% in order to prevent rent increases for seniors and people with disabilities. So that's so the rents and the income factors have really contributed to a growth in voucher renewal costs this year. In addition, Congress funded some new VASH vouchers, so vouchers for homeless veterans in the 2016 bill. Those come up for renewal this year. And more generally, agencies across the country have restored about 60,000 housing vouchers that were eliminated following sequestration in 2013. When Congress produced budget deals 2014, 2015, and then a second deal in 2016, 2017 to relax the sequestration level budget caps, one result of that was Congress allocated funding to the voucher program to enable agencies to restore vouchers that have been cut following sequestration, and agencies have largely succeeded in doing that. By our estimate, virtually all of the sequestration losses that we saw in 2013 and 2014, which was nearly 90,000 vouchers nationally, all of those have been reversed. And that's a very good thing in communities around the country, but that increases the cost of renewing vouchers for 2017. So this is a long way of saying that to renew all vouchers that households are currently using will require an increase of about $1.2 billion for voucher renewals in 2017, which is a good bit above the Senate bill level, and even more above the House bill level. These are the bills that the committees approved last summer. As I said, we've posted a report explaining all the details on this. What the recent update did was present estimates of vouchers in use that would be left unfunded under various funding scenarios in the final bill. So nationally, under the Senate bill level, about 25,000 vouchers in use would be left unfunded. If Congress were to do something very radical, like simply pass a continuing resolution that provided flat funding for voucher renewals in 2017, the loss would be on the order of $100,000, basically reinstituting the sequestration cuts of 2013. So those state estimates are on our website, and we hope folks will find those useful. I'd be happy to answer any questions about those. So that's 2017, and then, of course, the 2018 appropriations is also on the agenda. As I mentioned, well, just to back up a bit. So the overarching issue here is that we're still operating under the Budget Control Act spending caps, so there are separate caps for defense discretionary programs and non-defense discretionary programs. The 2013 sequestration not only imposed across-the-board cuts in 2013, but it lowered the spending caps for later years through 2021. The two budget deals I mentioned, 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, mitigated some of those reductions in those years. But we're back to what we call the sequestration level spending caps for 2018. What that means is that the non-defense discretionary spending cap for 2018 is actually slightly below the 2017 level in nominal terms. So it's about $3 billion lower. In addition, the pressure will actually be even greater than that on non-defense programs, and that's partly because in recent years Congress has provided several $billion in additional funds for veterans health care every year. That has required offsets and cuts in other areas. In addition, while we would not expect voucher renewal funding or project-based Section 8 renewals or other rental assistance renewals to go up as much in 2018 as they have in 2017. Those costs will rise because of rising rents and continuing stagnating incomes. And so to prevent losses of assistance to families, the HUD budget will need additional dollars in a broader context in which funding overall for non-defense discretionary programs is being reduced. So we're starting from a very challenging place in looking at 2018 appropriations. In addition, the House budget resolutions that we've seen in recent years have all proposed even deeper cuts to non-defense discretionary programs below the Budget Control Act spending caps. During the campaign, President Trump talked about making reductions in non-defense discretionary programs, and we have a report up on our website about the Trump penny plan if you'd like to look at that. So it's going to be very challenging, and throughout the budget debates in recent years, the principle of parity has been really key to protecting funding for housing assistance and community development programs. The principle of parity says that we don't relax the Budget Control Act spending caps for defense programs without also relaxing them for non-defense domestic priorities by an equal amount. And this principle of parity, for example, was what enabled the budget deals 2014 through 2017 that relaxed caps for defense programs. It required also relaxing caps for non-defense programs, which allowed us, for example, to restore all the vouchers that were cut under sequestration. So the principle of parity has been very important. But it will be very challenging to sustain that this year. It appears that President Trump is planning to send up a defense funding supplemental bill for 2017 next month. That bill could very well attempt to make an end run around the budget caps for defense programs, basically breaking parity. and so that's one challenge. The budget resolution, when Congress gets around to writing a 2018 budget resolution, that resolution will include a non-defense discretionary spending cap level. It may well include a reduction below the Budget Control Act spending cap level for 2018. So there's certainly the risk of even deeper cuts to non-defense programs. But again, regardless of what's in the budget resolution, regardless of what President Trump proposes when his administration issues a budget, that's only the beginning of the process, and it's important to keep that in mind. As I mentioned early on, the appropriations process is one area where Democrats and moderate Republicans who are defenders of housing assistance programs have a lot of leverage in the debate because they need their votes in order to move appropriations bills. So you have to keep that in mind. Okay.
So, Doug, this is Cindy.
Yep.
So I do want to have time for questions, and and we will also talk about the advocacy that we have planned. But have you been following the low-income housing tax credit conversation at all?
Yeah. Let me just say a couple words about that and about infrastructure too. So, So there's a general concern that seems to be well-founded that if a tax reform bill includes significant reductions in corporate tax rates, which it is likely to, that this could have a negative impact on low-income tax credit pricing, which in effect would reduce the amount of capital that tax credits yield for development projects. What I would note is that my sense is that tax committee staff are very much aware of this issue. The low-income housing tax credit has pretty strong bipartisan support in Congress, and so they're looking for ways, if the bill does reduce corporate tax rates, as it's likely to, ways to mitigate any negative effects on the low-income housing tax credit. And so there's various ideas that are floating around that I won't go into, and I don't know the details of a lot of them myself anyway. So there's that issue. In addition, a tax reform bill potentially is also an opportunity to expand support for affordable housing. So there's this Cantwell-Hatch bill that I'm sure you all are familiar with that would expand the tax credit program as well as to make some changes to make it more useful for developing housing for lower income households. In addition, I want to flag another thing. As you all know, while the tax credit is really an essential tool for the development of affordable rental housing, it's not very useful for developing affordable housing for households with extremely low incomes unless you layer additional rental assistance or other subsidies on top of it. And the Cantwell-Hatch bill, while it's somewhat helpful, really wouldn't do that much to address that problem. We've developed a renter's credit proposal over the last several years, and it's our understanding that Senator Brown from Ohio, who's chair of the Banking Committee and is also on the Finance Committee, is planning to introduce a bill that would establish a renter's credit, though the contours of the proposal are a bit uncertain at the moment. I would just note, keep an eye out for that. And there seems to be some interest in the House tax writing committees on the renter's credit idea too. So that's a way of saying that to the extent that opportunities surface during the tax debate, and they will surface, likely only if Democrats play a significant role in the tax reform legislation, which is very much an open question. But if they do, there may well be opportunities not only to protect the tax credit, of course, but to expand it and to improve it and maybe to add a renter's credit as well, though those are steep hills to climb under any scenario. So And then I'll say a word about infrastructure, too, because I know it's been getting a lot of press lately. President Trump talked a lot about boosting spending on infrastructure during the campaign, but the path forward on that is really unclear, to say the least. What does seem clear is that infrastructure is not a priority for congressional Republicans. And while Democrats, senior Democrats in the Senate specifically, have floated a really broad infrastructure package of ideas, their ideas are very different from those that have been floated by the Trump administration. The Trump administration seems focused on providing tax incentives for investors. The Democrats are focused on providing direct spending in a wide range of areas. So I think where all this comes down is that while in theory housing is certainly infrastructure, and the Democrats' proposal specifically mentions housing, affordable housing is an important area that would deserve investment under an infrastructure bill, the outlook and the path forward on this is really unclear now. And I think at this point we'll just have to wait and see what President Trump proposes specifically, and whether they're able to put something together that Democrats can support and then move it forward in Congress. So a lot of uncertainty there, and potentially not much opportunity, but there may be opportunities as well.
Thank you, Doug. I really appreciate that. It was a great summary of a lot going on and a lot of uncertainty. Before we open up the lines, Joyce, do you want to talk a little bit about the advocacy that we're doing on the federal level with the PA?
Sure, and then I did want to say something about the tax credit. So many of you hopefully have seen our emails, and it's been in our newsletter. The Housing Alliance is doing a big push the week of February 20th. We're doing local district visits with the new representatives in Congress, Representative Fitzpatrick, Representative Smucker, and Representative Evans. And we're also targeting trying to use our resources effectively, reaching out to members of the Republican House members around the state that have influential seats on committees. So we're going to see, and we have a full list, and pretty much all of the meetings are scheduled except for Representative Barletta and Representative Fitzpatrick. But hopefully within a couple of days those will be firmed up. So the plan is, like we've always done, go in teams of people. We will have for-profit, not-for-profit developers, social service providers, certainly people with lived experience. Someone from the Housing Alliance will be there. We'll be talking about solutions that are working and how the federal resources help make those a reality. Cindy, we will have a webinar next Thursday where we'll go over the ask and the talking points and sort of the plan for the meetings. In addition to that, we probably will have individual planning calls with the teams of people that are going out. Going back to my original point, so we're going to do House members, and we're also scheduled to see Senator Toomey's all of his district offices. I think there are 6 total. We have all of those scheduled again the week of the 20th. They're in recess that week, so they will be home. So if anybody wants to participate in any of those, please email me. There's a link, but feel free to email. So we're going to go to with Senator Toomey, the Allentown office, Erie, Harrisburg, Philadelphia, Scranton, Pittsburgh, and Johnstown. I think that's it. We're, I think, as Doug just said, pretty serious days that we live in, but for those of us at the Housing Alliance, it's never an easy lift to advocate for more resources for housing and homelessness for people with extremely low incomes. So we will continue on to do my little cheerleading with our head held high and continue to tell the story about people from Pennsylvania who need the opportunity to have a home, a safe, decent, affordable home. We just went on and used. So,
Steve Fisher.
Oh, hey, Steve Fisher. That's
Great.
yes. someone have a question?
Thanks, Joyce. So if
I did
want to.
Can I make one clarification?
Yeah, go ahead.
Though I did hear Doug talk about the Hatch Cantwell.
You said you were bidding for?
Okay, so
I just wanted to say we are going to be working. That will probably be part of our
hasn't come in yet.
Can people mute if they're not speaking to the group, which is Joyce?
Yeah, that was the main thing. I could, but I probably just do it all at the same time.
Is that Steve?
It is.
Can you
anyway.
Okay, I need to figure out how to do that.
I can try and go in and mute the line, Cindy. Okay. But anyway, if people, I've already gotten emails that people want to participate, so please just shoot us an email or call any
there
office.
Already. I don't even remember.
Hey, Steve Fisher, are you there? Anyway.
Is that a jacket?
I'll try and email.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to mute all. You know how to do that, Joyce.
Yeah, let me see if I can go in and do it.
Okay. So, yeah, sign up, email us, whatever. Let us know. District visits the week of the 20th. The 20th itself is President's Day, but the 21st through the 24th.
Yeah, we start the 21st.
And then March 2nd visit in D.C.
Yes.
And, and if you can't make if you can't make our meeting, you can go on your own, but we can also help you with material. We will have a letter to hand the congressman or his staff or the senator's staff. We will have talking points for those of you who are participating. If you want to send a letter, you can do that. The important thing is to be heard. And I would add to invite these folks out, the electeds out, to see what you're doing because, they get overwhelmed with requests. And the budget is a big thing with a lot of numbers. And this is true on the state level as well as the federal level. It's important for them to understand that, for instance, CDBG is not just a line item with numbers attached to it. It's not money that stays in Washington. It's money that comes into our communities and is really essential for community revitalization as well as providing homes and doing other stuff. I'm just picking that one item as an example. But, whatever programs you're using, make sure that your representatives, your senators, know how that money is being spent in the community. And a great way to do it is to invite them out. Don't be offended if the staff comes instead of the member himself, because staff does a lot of work and they will communicate. Keep in communication with these folks. It's really important. Any questions for Doug, for Joyce? I do want to leave a little time for the state budget, but Doug gave us a lot of information. Questions?
Cindy.
Star 7 to unmute. Yep.
Cindy, this is Jeff from Silk. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. A couple quick questions. One, when is President Trump's budget coming out?
Well, that's pretty unclear. The talk as of 2 weeks ago was that they would produce a budget brief by the end of February and then a more detailed budget in late April or early May. But, there have been some news reports over the last several days that suggest that they won't really be ready to produce a budget brief by the end of February, partly because the confirmation of Mick Mulvaney, who's been nominated to head up the Office of Management and Budget, hasn't proceeded as quickly as they'd like. So it's pretty uncertain.
Okay, and the other question I had was on HUD Secretary Ben Carson. I saw he was approved by the the banking committee, but I haven't seen a floor vote yet. Can you give any perspective on that, when that's going to happen, or what you see?
Well, he seems to be a lower priority. I think, their priorities for confirmation right now are to fill some of the, what they consider to be higher priority agencies, like, the Defense and Homeland Security and so on. But also, part of it is that for the most controversial nominees, they want to move those first while they still have Jeff Sessions as a senator, so he can provide any tie-breaking votes as necessary. And so I think Ben Carson is not considered to be so controversial a nominee at this point relative to the others. So my guess is he'll be at, closer to the end of the line. We certainly haven't heard anything this week or next week about his coming to the floor. So also uncertain. I would expect him to be confirmed, though. My sense is that based in large part on the private meetings and the written responses for the record that he provided to senators in the committee, Senator Brown and Warren and others, that he persuaded them that he had a sincere and strong commitment to HUD's basic mission and would do what he could to strengthen HUD programs. So that's my sense of it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to wrap up the federal portion now. Clearly, there's a lot that we will talk about in the future. There's a lot of uncertainty now, but what we do know is that we need to advocate. As Joyce said, that's what we've always done, and that's what we'll continue to do. And we'll bring you details as we have them. I really appreciate your report, Doug, and certainly we'll keep in touch with you.
Okay, well, thanks for having me.
Thank you.
I want to turn to the state now, because Governor Wolf gave his address yesterday, his budget proposal, and to cut to the chase, there's really no change in the line items that we've been following, but I will get to that in a little more detail. First, let me tell you, it's a $32.3 budget, $1 billion budget proposal. That is for the general fund. The total operations of the state is much higher than that. It's slightly higher by $670 million, and then slightly higher than last year, driven by necessary increases in pensions and human services largely, and some other costs. There is roughly a $3 billion structural deficit, which he proposes to close in two ways: $2 billion in savings through consolidations of departments and other efficiencies. And those consolidations would include, I guess the biggest one is creating a new Department of Health and Human Services, which would include Department of Human Services, Department of Health, Aging, Drug and Alcohol. So that would be obviously a very large department. DHS is already pretty large. But through consolidations, there would be there are proposed savings there. Also consolidating corrections and parole, and maybe something else into Department of Criminal Justice, in addition, and then so that's $2 billion. He proposes $1 billion in additional revenue, going back to a severance tax for a large chunk of that, going to eliminate a few sales tax exemptions. This is not the broad-based change to sales tax that we saw in previous years, or that we saw coming from a number of legislators, Republican. I guess there's a bipartisan effort, but not the changes that we saw in terms of the property tax bill that would rely on sales tax changes. These exemptions have more to do with primarily a lot of it with corporate use. There is some, I know one that stands out is we currently don't tax the purchase or repair of an airplane in Pennsylvania. There are a few other things like that. He's also proposing that folks in communities that rely on the state police pay $25 a year. I believe it's a year. Right now, that's some special funded Department of Transportation that goes to supporting the state police. But it's anyway, I don't know I can't give you the details of that right now. That's definitely going to get some pushback. Of course, everything gets pushback when it comes to rescue. But let me see. There's an interesting proposal with very little detail to block grant tax credits. And essentially what it says, I'm going to see if I can pull up this email quickly that I should have pulled up earlier. There's a question and answer with reporters after the budget address yesterday. There was a question about who's choosing among the block grant for tax credits, and Secretary of Budget Randy Albright said decisions will be made by the administration collectively, looking at performance metrics, rolling application. Let me see, there was some language elsewhere in the budget that actually talked about, it was only about 2 sentences, but consolidating, block granting the tax credits with an emphasis on education, business, and community development. So hopefully that means that the NAP will still get its fair share. It is listed in the budget because where they do list current tax credits, it's still there as at $18 million, and it would take legislation to change that. So neighborhood assistance program tax credit is still in at $18 million. The Keystone Communities is back to $6.357 million, a tiny shadow of its former self. Now, it appears on paper to be a drop of close to $6 million from the year that we're currently in, and even the previous year after a supplemental that went in at the last June, raising Keystone Communities to 12.85. But it's my understanding is that additional roughly $6 million was earmarked for something and did not go into the general pot that people applied for. And I know, Jeff, you're on the call and you follow Keystone Communities for the accessible housing piece, and I don't know if anyone else is on who uses that, who wants to speak to that in just a minute. But let me also say, so in terms of other line items that we've been following, and as you know, there are very few in the state budget that actually address housing. Homeless assistance, the governor's proposing stable flat funding at $18.5 million. The same for the Human Services Development Fund. This is not the block grant, but the line item fund, flat funding at 13.5, where they have been for the last 1, 2, 3, 4 years at least. I do want to make a general comment about DCED's budget. Again, while Keystone Communities is very small, and that's basically what we've been following, the agency as a whole is looking at yet another decrease. Their total budget would see a decrease of $9 million down to $385, I'll say $0.5 million, and I pulled out one of my budget sheets from years ago. I'm looking at the 2009-10 budget, where DCD's total. Let's go back to. It was actually 2008 before the big cut. 2008-9, it was at $617.8 million. We're now down to $385.5 million. So the department itself is very, very small, which also leads to some of the savings that the governor is counting on would come from a loss of about 3,400 state jobs through attrition, through consolidation, and that is in addition to losses in the past. He's also proposing raising the minimum wage to $12 an hour. I'm sure there will be a little bit of conversation about that. He's already gotten flack from Senate leadership that there was no discussion of the pensions in the budget. I heard an analysis this morning on my way into work that there's one commentator's assumption is that he is saving pensions as a negotiating tool, so that if the legislators can pass so if they want pension, they'll negotiate with him on pensions and something else that Wolf wants out of the budget. So generally speaking, in Harrisburg, the reactions were much more pleasant, shall we say. There was some pushback, particularly from Senate leadership. House leadership was more conciliatory. The tone is much different than it was Wolf's first 2 years because the budget's much different. He's not asking for any broad-based revenue increases, tax increases, and he's doing a lot of cutting, or at least consolidation and and some program cutting. He is also doing an increase in education, and I didn't spend a lot of time looking at the education budget, but I know that is his priority. So I want to stop, give other people a chance to comment or ask some questions. *7, if you have muted, you can unmute yourself. Anybody?
Hey, Cindy, it's Jeff from Silk again. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up the Keystone Communities. The one thing, and I think we're still waiting for this from a webinar where you had DCD staff on there, is number of folks waiting for home modifications. It seems like they'll say, we'll get back to you with the number of folks on our waiting list, and they never really seem to get a good, clear number on that. But they tell us there's a waiting list every year.
Okay, so we'll try to follow up with that also. I'm just writing down DCD home mod waiting list.
And I don't know if they keep waiting lists for any other programs in DCD or anything else for housing that the Housing Alliance tracks.
I'm not sure that if there's anything else that we're tracking that would have a waiting list. But anyway, we'll try to figure that out. I don't know, was there someone who had a response for Jeff? Or?
Hi, Jeff. It's Cecilia with SDHP. I was just wondering, when you refer to the waiting list, are you looking at, like, overall the whole state waiting list or individual county waiting list? Do you know what DCD is referring to when they say waiting list?
Yes. The whole state, basically, how many people are waiting for home modifications in their program, and supposedly they've mentioned in the hearings, I've been to hearings where I think the current Secretary, Dennis Davin, has mentioned, we can get that information to you, but they say, we do have a waiting list. It's rarely given, I can't remember getting a number. I think it's probably been in at least around 100, give or take at least, but I'm not sure what the current numbers are.
And just to give folks a little background here, a small part, roughly $1 million out of the Keystone Communities, I don't know if they still segregate that $1 million, but goes for home modifications to keep people, so that people with disabilities can stay in their homes or move into a home. It used to be a separate line item before the consolidation into Keystone Communities when there was housing and redevelopment assistance, there was the new communities, Elm Street, Main Street, and there was accessible housing that were all rolled into Keystone Communities and drastically cut. And so primarily most of the money from Keystone Communities does go to the Elm Street, Main Street, KOZ programs with, is it still roughly $1 million that you're seeing in home mods, Jeff or Cecilia?
I think it's around $1 million. It might be a little more. Just to give some perspective, back in, I think I want to say 2008, whenever the separate line item was fully funded, it was at $3 million, and actually seniors that have mobility issues also use that. They try to get it for folks that are not in a Medicaid waiver that would have those type of benefits. So you try to make sure they're able to get home mods and other programs. But yeah, that's yep.
Okay.
Cindy, can I just add one thing too?
Yeah, Joyce.
So it's Joyce. Cindy drafted a letter that we sent to the Pennsylvania House and Senate, and it's in our newsletter today in the Spotlight. And we just wanted to let folks know if they want to cut and paste and modify it and send it to your state rep and state senator, that would be great.
Okay.
Thanks. Any other questions or comments on the state budget?
Hi, Cindy. Joe Willard at PEC.
Hey, Joe.
Hey, is Housing Alliance or everybody else going to do like an analysis of what's in the budget for housing issues?
You mean beyond those 3 line items?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can. Let's talk that through, and we can come up with something. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Anyone else?
Yes, this is Jeff. One other quick question. I think most folks are aware of this, but it seems to be a topic of every group that I go to, is the 4-in-1 consolidation with DHS, Department of Human Services, Aging, Drug and Alcohol, and Health. And I guess the question is, is there going to be any impact on housing programs, or there's not? I know there's not a lot in there, although the money, the state money that we get does help quite a few people, though it is really key. But I'm just kind of curious if there's any thought as to how the consolidation may impact that, if at all.
Well, I think it would be worthwhile having a few of us get together, people who use the various programs in the different departments, and let's talk that through. I want everyone to keep in mind that this is the governor's proposal. This is the beginning of the budget conversation in Pennsylvania. The legislature will now recess for about 6 weeks of appropriations committee hearings, and then the bills move through the House and Senate. So let's figure out what's important for us to be monitoring and advocating on regarding the consolidation as well as line items, and we'll be keeping an eye on what's happening. So I appreciate that suggestion. Anything else?
This is Joe Willard again.
Yeah.
Cindy, I'm sure everybody else on the phone knows this, but you're going to be moving on to your next opportunity, and I just want to thank you publicly for all the help, the vision, and the leadership that you have provided, we providers and everybody else throughout Pennsylvania for so many years, helping us get through the minefield of Harrisburg and the federal stuff and all. Thank you. I do look forward to continue working with you in your new endeavors there.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate that very much. It looks like I will be around for a couple of months, so maybe two more of these calls. But I really do appreciate your sentiment, and certainly look forward to working with quite a few of the people who are on the call. So thank you. And that brings us to 12 o'clock. Good timing. And unless anyone else has pressing concerns or questions, I'll pause for a moment. We will talk to you in March. Thank you.